There we said we made from water every living thing. So here the Quran tells us a major component of all living tissue is water. And cells is part of living tissue. So it gives us the 4 descriptive terms of a cell. And that's why that is so-called justified me in describing the lump, so-called lump, as a mass of cells actually.
Okay.
Now it says, attached by a stalk. Now, the word they use is alaka. You know the word alaka?
Yeah, alaka means to dangle, to hang.
Yeah. So that is my understanding. It's something. It is as an entity suspended through a stalk or string attached to another entity.
Yeah.
Right. So alaka also means a leech.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
I see. Okay.
It means a leech.
All right.
And because now you can see, you can also use that description. You can see now if there's a picture there where you can see the comparison of a leech to the early embryo. See there's a leech on the one side, on the right side. Those two pictures. And there's the embryo on the left side. You see the resemblance. Who knew that that embryo is hardly 2 weeks old? Now there is a resemblance. You can't.
How big is this? This is obviously very small.
Yeah, tiny, 1 or 2 millimeters.
So I mean, this is not as if somebody could, like in the year 620, like open up and see this.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So. Right. So then, and why also a leech? Because a leech, the embryo, like a leech, parasitizes. It lives off the mother's circulation and also clings to the mother's womb.
Okay.
So that is a similarity between leech and embryo. Now it says, then we formed out of it a chewed embryonic mass. Why chewed? Right? Now at this stage, the embryo is 1 month old and consists of divisions which we call somites and gives the embryo a segmented appearance. Now at this stage, the embryo resembles a plasticine model with biting teeth marks. Now this has actually been demonstrated in the lecture hall where the experimentalists took the piece of clay, and he sank his teeth into the clay, and the resemblance between that chewed clay and the early embryo was remarkable. And you can see that I demonstrated.
I saw it there.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, you see there, it's a similar thing as the leech also.
Yeah.
Just check with the next one. There's the next one. There's the leech. There's the leech. We actually gave them the wrong picture. There's the leech.
Okay.
All right, now go back. There's the biting teeth marks. You can see there. If I can use this, show that there's the teeth marks, right?
Yes.
Now go to that's the plasticine model. Now go to the real. No, go back. Go back to go to the left. The left. There's the embryo with the biting teeth marks. You see there.
Ah. Is this a human embryo?
There's a human embryo, like also I think about 2 millimeters.
Yeah, I mean it clearly looks like a chewed piece of flesh or meat or something.
Why would somebody make a statement like that?
Yeah.
Okay, now go back there. The next says now. Okay. Then we form bones within the mass of cells and clothe the bones with elongated muscle groups attached to it, right? Now, some critic again sees a flaw here. He says, according to the Quran, you can see there, the bone is formed first, and then the bone is then clothed with muscle, right? He says, but if you look at hard muscle, he says hard muscle forms well before the bone. So the Quran is actually incorrect because it mentions bone first instead of muscle first.
All right.
But now, the argument is that there are three types of muscle. There's the cardiac muscle, which we developed before the bone. He's correct in that. There's smooth muscle, which lines the intestinal organs, and there's striated muscle. Now, the Qur'an refers here to striated muscle. And why do I make that statement? Because striated muscle consists of elongated fibers and is attached to bone. Right?
This is the muscle that we're talking about.
Yeah, you see,
Striated muscle.
So he just read the Quran blindly. You see, they don't study the Quran.
Yeah.
They don't study it. The Quran refers to striated muscle there, which is elongated. You can see there's long fibers.
That is attached to bone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Unlike the heart muscle.
Unlike the heart muscle hasn't got these long fibers. It's not attached to bone.
Yes.
Moreover, you find the word, they see the word, the conjunction appears several times there, and then. See there.
Right.
Now, that word is thumma.
Thumma.
Right. Now, thumma doesn't only convey sequence. It also means simultaneous events, coordination of activities, or one stage merging into another stage. You see the how poor the English language is if you compare and then to thumma.
Yeah.
Now, so in other words, the embryo doesn't develop in this way. It doesn't form the head first, and then the trunk, and then the legs. The tissues are formed simultaneously, although there is still a sequence, but they are formed simultaneously. So, similarly, in the past, it was incorrectly assumed that only once the bone is formed in the embryonic limb do the adjacent muscle cells migrate inwards and clothe the bones like a sheath, clothing the arm and become attached to it. Now we know that's not the case, that bone and muscle develop more or less concomitantly at the same time. Right? And that is accommodated by the word thumma. Right? Now comes another question. But why does Allah still mention bone first?
Yeah. Then we formed bones within the mass
And
clothed the bony framework with elongated muscle attached
Bone
to it.
and muscle develop at
So
the
the word
same time.
thumma here should be actually then we formed bones within while clothing or as we clothe it with muscle.
Exactly. But now listen to this. I looked at that verse and I thought to myself, it happens concurrently, right? But Allah is still mentioning both. The word thumma means concurrently. It means at the same time, and it means also one stage merging with another stage. But still, why does Allah mention the word bone first? Then I consulted a professor, a lady by the name of Sue Kitson, who was the head of the Department of Cell Biology at UCT.
The University of Cape Town.
And I showed her this verse, and I said to her, I can't make sense of this. What do you, does muscle, he says, no, muscle and bone develop at the same time. But she says, if you used a special cell staining technique, and that cell staining technique can distinguish between muscle and bone. And if you apply that dye, that staining liquid, to the embryonic limb under the microscope, you will see the bone first, and then the muscle.
Okay.
So the Qur'an is perfectly correct in mentioning bone first, but at the same time employing the word thumma, which is a more accurate description how embryonic processes unfold.
Right. So what we're saying is that this verse here, then we formed bones within the mass and clothed the bones, the bony framework, with elongated muscle. What you're saying is that this professor tells you that although it's almost a simultaneous evolution or development, the bone does manifest first.
Because the bone is needed to guide the muscle to adapt to its organization. So the bone patterning dictates muscle patterning. It's almost like the framework of the bone leads the muscle how to clothe the bone.
Okay.
That's why the bone had to form first.
Yeah.
Now,
So this professor that, may I ask, was she a Muslim professor at
she
the University
was
of Cape Town?
She was dumbfounded.
Oh, really?
Dumbfounded.
Really?
Yeah.
So she's not Muslim?
No,
like,
no,
oh.
no, not at all.
And you showed her the verse?
I showed her and I said, I want to make sense out of this.
And she said, wow, if you put it under a microscope, the bone does manifest first.
Yeah, first.
Okay, that's very, 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 very interesting.
Okay, now comes the next key verse. Then we produce out of it a new creation. Right. Now, you see, Anwar, you can see Allah describes here the early embryo. Allah embryos, we mentioned a couple of stages, fertilization, remember? We mentioned implantation, we mentioned the placental stage, right? Those processes are shared by all the higher vertebrates. So if you look at that stage of the embryo, you won't be able to say this is a human or this is a fish, or this, you won't be able to say it because they have the same basic processes. But now look at what Allah says, now there's something taking place here. Then, thumma, we develop out of it a new creation. So this is a place of divergence, where the human embryo now embarks on a new phase of development. You know, becoming distinctly human now. And for me, this marks the beginning of the seed of human consciousness. Now, what is interesting at this stage, what they discovered was a particular gene in the brain. At that stage is switched on in the human embryo.
Are you serious? At like 40 days or like?
Yeah,
something
switched on. And that gene influences other genes which affect the brain.
I didn't know there was a brain at that kind of
the
stage.
brain is formed very early, by the third week already.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they can't put an exact time, but they say it's between 9 to 19 weeks that this gene is switched on.
Okay.
Which affects other genes, which influences the human brain. This gene is not switched on in animals. And this active gene now, which was inactive, causes a rapid growth of the human brain. And causing complex neural changes within the brain. So for me here, it tells me two things. Recall back when I said about the genetic instructions determining the species type, right? Nothing was said of some kind of something coming from the outside, some intangible force or something. Here Allah says here something is happening inside the human brain here, and there's a word ansanahu in that phrase there, which means to progress to an elevated state, right? Which is a hint as to the limitless intellectual and moral potential of the human embryo. So these changes, these new creation changes, only take place in the human brain and not in the other vertebrates, right? Okay, now we're nearing to the end now, so I'm going to quote you another important verse. He creates you in the darkness of the cavities of your mother's wombs, one act of creation after the other in 3 layers. I wish you had the other translation, Yusuf Ali's translation, when you could compare it. But
yeah, let's look at it. So here's the Yusuf Ali translation. Let's look
go
at
to the second sentence. The first one I don't think is relevant. So he formed you. Go from there.
Yeah, he then provided. No, he formed you in your mother's wombs, from one form to another, obscured, 3 levels deep. So then, be unto your God your protecting Lord.
I see.
Right. So he formed you in your mother's womb, from one form to another, obscured, 3 levels. Okay. Now the translation that you're offering is as follows.
Look at my translation. He creates you in the darkness of the cavities of your mother's womb, One act of creation after the other in 3 layers. Now, look at the accurate description of the womb here. It is a organ which is a chamber, it's got a cavity, right? In the cavities, it says the cavity. And the womb is pitch dark. Right? So it gives you a good description of the womb there, the Qur'an. Now, what does the 3 layers mean?
All right.
What does it mean by 3 layers? Now, okay, what happens is that when the embryos, now we're going back to the early embryo now, when the embryo is about 3 weeks old, it consists of 3 germ cell layers. It's called the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. The 3 germ cell layers, right? And those 3 layers, if all your organs will develop from those 3 basic layers, which is in place at the 3rd week, right? Now, just before that stage, the embryo consists of 2 cell layers, right? Then what happens? Those 3 cell layers, these cells migrate and they reorganize themselves and they become 3 layers. So, and this process is called gastrulation. Now, gastrulation basically is a series of complex processes of growth and differentiation, whereby this structure of 2, which consists of 2 tissue layers, 2 cell layers, reorganizes itself into a 3-layered configuration. And those 3 layers is Allah referring to there. It's those 3 layers are the ectoderm, the endoderm, and the mesoderm. And those 3 layers, all other tissues will develop from it. Now, the complexity of this process, I just explained to you, that's called gastrulation. Now, the complexity of that process is conveyed by the term. Look, go back to my verse there. Look at that term there. One act of creation after the other. It's like saying creation after creation. Allah is doing all this, fashioning the embryo, shaping it, elongating it, stretching it, bending it, bulging it into various forms. That is why Allah says the word act of creation, one after the other. It gives you an indication of the complexity of the process. And the distinguished embryologists once mentioned that the most important event in a human's life is gastrulation, is that process.
Wow.
So the Qur'an, therefore, in summary, mentions 5 stages of embryogenesis. Fertilization, remember, implantation, the placental stage, segmentation, remember, the chewed embryonic lump, and lastly, gastrulation. Those are the 5 important. Now, the question is now Allah says, now, how is it possible that a 7th century individual who had no knowledge, right, could describe the fact that the fertilized egg contains the genetic instructions that will regulate the whole process of embryology? How he could also know that the microscopic structures hidden in the darkness of the womb, how he could recognize those structures, and how he could also know the sequence of development of the human embryo, where it only became established science in the second half of the 20th century. Right.
Yeah, that is very, very difficult to understand without seeing divine involvement.
Okay. Then the final verse. Now Allah says, He speaks about the embryonic stage, then He says, then at length after that you will die. And then He shall raise you up on resurrection day. Right. Now, think about this now. This is a typical theme of the Qur'an. It always combines a scientific phenomenon, like the development of the human embryo, with a religious doctrine or a metaphysical statement. We spoke about the development of the embryo, which is science, but then Allah speaks about the raising up. Right. Now, why does He do that? Now, if you look at all the stages we went through, from, life began 3.5 billion years ago, right? Now, the Quran speaks about those stages in other chapters, which we didn't focus on today. But the Quran takes up the human story from the embryo, from the fertilized egg, then describes the various embryonic stages in which we discuss now in the egg. Then after birth, what happens? Stages continue, right? Now, we pose a question, isn't it conceivable, or at least reasonable, that all these stages, from 3.5 billion years ago, we've gone through stages and stages, and as I said, the Quran picks up the story, the human story, from the human embryo, and the stages continue after the baby's born, infancy, toddler stage, and those.
Yeah.
Isn't it feasible or plausible, therefore, that this pattern of stages should continue beyond death on a higher level, especially if this is claimed by a being who is the all-knower according to that embryology? Do you understand?
Yes.
In other words, take note of what this being is saying, because He's just showed you now He's the all-knower. And He then claims, I will raise you up again. So, in other words, to end of the series, or to end of this lecture, the Quran doesn't expect us or require of us to accept life after death or a religious doctrine based on faith only, but provides a logical basis why we should at least ponder or the possibility of a continued existence beyond death.
And that is something that I've noticed working through the Quran, is that the Quran does not make sort of demands without offering some sort of justification around that demand. And in this case, it basically lays out the phases, the procedures, the mechanisms of how the embryo develops, and then says, so using this as a model, as a framework, so then in a similar way, will you enter the next realm, the next existence, which is completely plausible then, if you consider that you were a single cell, that you were clay eventually, you were just matter, non-living matter, you were just chemical, chemical substance, carbon-based chemicals, and you move towards some sort of life form. And so, the amazing features of creation in terms of bringing us from clay to human life is then, the argument is completed by saying, in a similar way, will you move from human life to the next level of existence.
So our evolutionary journey will continue.
Yes.
And then but like you say, and then but the punching blow is who makes that claim?
Yeah.
Is the one who just showed you that He's the all-knower.
Yeah.
That you must take note of what this being is telling you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I've looked at these verses, and it's in your book, and so people who want to really go into it more in detail I would say it's a good idea for you to get the book if you're a doctor or just somebody that wants to relate science to the Quran. What it does is it shows that this is a being that possesses knowledge that is beyond the normal human intellect, at least at this stage. And we're just trying to make up time still. We still, as humanity, we're still catching up with these things. Doc, it was really another very, very eye-opening and insightful session that we've had here. I don't think it's it's every person's cup of tea to go. I mean, we've gone into quite a bit of detail. For those who might not be as into the detail, I think the key points I think you would have picked up is that, the pictures of the lump of flesh,
Yes.
which the Quran says is a lump of flesh. And if you look at the picture of the embryo, which is 1 or 2 millimeters big, not the embryo, the pre-embryo, what is that? The zygote? Or what? I don't
Yeah,
know.
the blastocyst.
The blastocyst looks like a lump of flesh. If you look at the burial of the seed, where the Quran says we made the woman almost her body like soil in which the seed is planted, the soil is prepared. And if you look at those pictures there, that sticks in my mind also. So it's been amazing. Thank you very much, Doc. I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, really.
Yeah, and I think all of us can now feel comfortable that we are not being asked to believe anything that is irrational, that is at odds with what is happening in the real world. And that is why the Quran so many times says, look around you and look for the signs of God in the environment
How
around
many
you.
times does it say that?
Yeah. And that's what we're doing. We're looking at the signs. We're looking at nature. We're looking at the embryo. We're looking at the origin of the universe. So, inshallah, I hope this has been rewarding for you also, as it was for me.
I've enjoyed it tremendously.
Yeah, and we look forward to working together again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.